Good afternoon, and welcome to our weekly Chair Chat. My name is Juan Thomas, and I have the honor of serving as chair of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section. And today, I am so honored to have one of our council members and my dear friend, Melanie Bates, as our guest. Melanie is the founder and owner of a Washington, D.C. company called the Melanie Bates Consulting, LLC, where she focuses on communications, and the overall focus is on criminal justice reform. Melanie believes that poverty, the lack of education, and other social issues should not feed into the pipeline of prison or to the grave. Through consistent advocacy, she desires to elevate the factors that force many people to be impacted by the criminal justice system. Welcome, Melanie. We're glad to have you today.
Thank you for having me, Chair Thomas. It's an honor, and thank you for your leadership of this great section.
Well, Melanie, I'm glad to have you. And again, want to mention and highlight that you are part of our leadership in the section, a member of our section council. And could you just kind of briefly just tell us about your work? I kind of gave an introduction, but could you give us more detail about the work you do in the criminal justice space?
Sure, thank you. So I launched Melanie Bates Consulting in 2017. And as you stated, Mr. Chair, we are a DC-based policy and communications firm with a focus on justice reform, particularly around police misconduct and mass incarceration. The majority of our clients are nonprofit organizations that serve persons who are incarcerated or returning home following a period of incarceration. And we help amplify their missions through strategic branding, messaging, and advocacy campaigns.
Melanie, why should lawyers care about this work? Why is it important?
Thank you for asking that. I always refer to the quote by Justice Thurgood Marshall: mere access to the courthouse doors does not by itself assure a proper functioning of the adversary process. I believe as lawyers, it is incumbent upon us to ensure that every person, regardless of socioeconomic status, has access to quality legal representation. No one should have to show up to court unrepresented. We know how convoluted and confusing it can be, and we have a duty, I believe, and a privilege to serve our folks who are involved in the system.
You know, one of the issues that we're dealing with here in Illinois is cash bail reform. And in fact, our Supreme Court just halted the implementation of cash bail here in Illinois. A lot of us are working on that. So in my role as a lawyer here in Illinois and also as chair of our section, am finding an intersection between the work I do here and the work I do in our section. Could you kind of share the same information around the work you're doing in the context of the section and the work you do in Washington through your consulting company?
Sure. I neglected to mention after your first question, Mr. Chair, that the ABA has a model rule 6.1 that urges all attorneys to provide at least 50 hours of pro bono service per year. So thank you for sharing what you're doing towards that lofty goal. So how my work is intersected with my role as a council member, under the leadership of past Chair Will Schooley, I had the opportunity to publish a 2018 fall member op-ed. And unfortunately, around that time, I had to discuss the unconscionable killing of Mr. Botham John in Dallas, Texas. He was murdered in his own home by a police officer who mistakenly thought it was her own apartment. So that really rattled me as someone who's dedicated my personal and professional life and career to fighting these issues. So I wrote about our duty as lawyers and as a section to fight against these issues and to really speak out and hold those in power accountable for making meaningful change. That was one of the things that stuck out to me. Another honor that I had was to serve as the initial drafter of Resolution 116A. And this was passed at the ABA, and it urges the use of special prosecutors when investigating police-involved killings. I think it's critical, and it's so timely and relevant to what's going on in the world today. And the last point I'll mention, the last highlight as my work as a council member, was moderating and actually organizing a webinar on the impact of mass incarceration of communities of color in the wake of COVID-19. And we had the distinct honor and privilege to have members of the panel with lived experience. I believe we should always lead with lived experience. The persons closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So those are some highlights from my tenure here with the council.
We really appreciate your leadership and what you've done for our section and how you've really have impacted in a positive way our civil rights and social justice section and elevated the work of the American Bar Association. And I just want to say, GWAC should be proud because you are also a past president of GWAC. Could you kind of spend about 30 seconds on your leadership in GWAC and tell us what GWAC is?
Sure. Thank you for mentioning that, past President Thomas. So GWAC is an affiliate of the National Bar Association, which you had the privilege of serving as its president. I was the president of the local chapter of the Women's Lawyers Division. So the Black women lawyers in the DC area, we fall under something called the Greater Washington Area Chapter of the Women's Lawyers Division, more affectionately known as GWAC. So it was really an honor to serve back a little while ago. And I was awarded with Affiliate Chapter of the Year at the president of the National Bar. So it was really an honor to serve on the local level. Thank you.
Well, it's good to see you as a leader in our profession, not only locally in Washington and within our African-American legal community, but also nationally as well. You're doing a tremendous work. And in light of that, could you kind of talk about what should our viewers who are watching today know about the consequences of mass incarceration? And I ask you that question in the context of last month, we had as our guest a mutual friend of ours, Tawanda Turner Hawkins, who was also the chair of the Coalition of Racial and Ethnic Justice for the ABA. They're doing a lot of good work around identifying what's wrong with the school to prison pipeline. So could you connect mass incarceration to school to prison pipeline conversation?
Sure. Thank you for having that. And we actually had the opportunity to watch that. She's doing incredible work on a really pressing and timely issue. Again, the school to prison pipeline. It reflects zero tolerance policies within our schools. We've seen kids as young as pre-K being kicked out of school for doing something as little as throwing a chair. And what this does is it sends a signal to our children, our youth, whose brains are still developing, that they don't belong there. It's okay that they got sent home. And what are they doing when they're at home? Maybe getting into mischief, getting into things that they wouldn't otherwise be doing so if they were in the classroom. So what that feeds into is a larger issue of mass incarceration. The United States is unique. We have 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners.
Wow.
5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoners. I mean, we can't ignore that. Close to 2.3 million Americans are incarcerated in our prisons and jails today.
Wow. Do you happen to know of the 25% that we have in our prison system? Do you have the racial breakdown of those numbers?
I don't have the racial breakdown, but I can say anecdotally that this system impacts Blacks more than any other race. Here in DC at our local jail, it's 90.4, I believe, percent Black. Blacks make up less than half of the district's population.
Wow.
We have 90% Black people in DC jail, less than half of the district's population overall. So I think that really shows that the striking disparity in the numbers. There were other previous studies that I believe 8 out of 10 persons who were arrested in DC were Black. That's the local stats there. I think it's reflected on the national level as well.
How would you respond to someone who just says, well, Black people commit more crime? That's why they're arrested more and prosecuted more and put in jail more. Well, how would you respond to that?
I would say 400 years. I think everything that's going on now can be directly correlated to the founding of this country of slavery. As the ABA section, we had the honor to go down south to view Brian Stevenson's museum, and he shows each step of how we come out of slavery, to slave codes, to slave patrol. The very founding of police departments were to get slaves back to their masters. So that would be my response.
What you're doing there is connecting the historical legacy of slavery to poverty, lack of investment into communities, poor schools, poor housing, lack of resources, and how that creates environments where people struggle to survive.
Exactly. And that goes back to your theme for the bar year.
Right, and the over-policing of vulnerable communities. We see that throughout the country. So speaking of Washington and the theme for this year, which you know is economic justice, in March, we'll be coming to Washington, D.C. to have our Economic Justice Summit at Georgetown's Law School. What is the current landscape in our nation's capital? What's going on there locally that you'd like for us to know?
Sure. So I've shared the statistics of the demographics at the local jail. And actually recently, there's been a huge effort to reform our criminal code. And that has not been done, I believe, in like 100 years or some time. And the mayor recently vetoed that. That was passed by the council. So there's a lot of debate going on about sentences lengths, different types of violent crimes, what's going on here in the city. So we're working on a huge overhaul, which hopefully will work in the favor of our residents here in DC. And what's unique is that we're subject to federal control. No other jurisdiction in this country has to have their laws approved by the United States Congress. In 1997, there was an act passed called the National Capital Revitalization and Self-Government Improvement Act. And one result of this legislation was that we lost control of our criminal justice system. So any resident who's sentenced to a felony, any sentence longer than a year, is sent to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. But once they leave DC, we no longer have control over our residents. And what this means is that we can't implement reentry efforts. It's so much harder for family members to visit and travel all across the country to their loved ones. So it's a really severe disservice to our residents who are involved in the system to have them subject to that federal control.
Wow. I recently read an article about the fact that there is legislation passed years ago calling for a representative in Congress from the Cherokee Nation here in our country, which has not been implemented. Similarly, we have not achieved DC statehood. And so even though DC has a delegate in Congress, Eleanor Holmes Norton, her vote is limited. She can't vote in certain situations in Congress. And there is no representation in the US Senate for people that live in the District of Columbia. What has been the local impact, or what is the impact of not having local control, and particularly not having complete representation in the federal government?
So I think in the context of mass incarceration, when our residents are sent across the country, years ago, I believe there was a severe weather incident in Texas. And we have a lot of DC residents who served the time in the federal system in Texas. And we had to figure out, to go through the channels, how do we check on our residents? We can't even get in communication with them to see if they're okay. We've established an agency called the Corrections Information Council, which is charged with inspecting different facilities where our residents are. They can conduct interviews, gather information, and report back to council. Then that's really sometimes where it stops. We have that limited control and authority. There's measures in place, but really our hands are tied when it comes to our residents in the federal system. When they return home, we don't have a local halfway house. We have to use the halfway house that's in Baltimore, Maryland, which is nearly an hour away. So when people are coming out of the federal system after decades, Chair Thomas, decades, to a city that looks nothing like it did when they left, have to travel up and down the highway, even if they have the means to do that, to get IDs, to reapply for benefits, to see their families. So it makes reintegration so much more difficult. It has strains on the resources of our nonprofit organizations. We have a government agency called the Mayor's Office of Returning Citizen Affairs. We have things in place that are designed to help, but we need more.
So then what would you say are the solutions that would help better equip citizens to navigate these systems? What are some of the solutions?
I think it starts really from the entry point, knowing your rights. If you find yourself in an encounter with the police, what are your rights under the United States Constitution? You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to say, officer, I do not consent to searches. Officer, I'd like to see a lawyer. Officer, are you detaining me or am I free to go? Having these basic phrases in mind will help you initially in the situation. It will help our youth. It will help the community at large know what our rights are when they're at that entry point.
So you have educated us today but what do you want us to do? What is your call to action?
Well, thank you for asking that, Chair Thomas. I would say as lawyers, there are over 1 million lawyers in this country. I think we have an obligation to look at these issues. We all, have some connection to someone who's behind that wall, to really look at it and think, what can we do? We have a privilege of being a lawyer. Who can we call on? What reforms can we draft? I think we're obligated to ensure the protections afforded under the United States Constitution are applied fairly to all people, no matter your background, your economic status. There's 3 key things that I always like to share that the community can do is utilizing the power of social media. It's similar to what you're doing here. We have this chair chat that will be placed on YouTube and we can blast it across the globe. It has a meaningful impact. It's a free way to spread the message. Oftentimes we see around a big court case or right when something happens, it's all over social media. It's the trending topic. A couple days later, it kind of trails off. But keeping the pulse and holding strong and really keeping it out there will maybe effectuate change at a faster pace. Contacting your local government. Quote by Thomas Jefferson, I believe, the government closest to the people serves the people best. Many of the laws and policies that we see coming out of local government are directly attributed to ordinary citizens going down to City Hall raising a concern. So I think we should not forget the power of our voice. Speaking of which, voting. I mean, it goes without saying, we all need to vote. It really makes a tremendous difference. And then lastly, volunteering in the community. I think our youth need access to more better role models. They need more guidance. They need to see lawyers that look like you and I to have that hope and inspiration to dream bigger.
Well, you have truly inspired us today with your knowledge and information and your call to action. Do you have any closing remarks you'd like to share at this time?
Sure. So I have the privilege of serving on the advisory board of a nonprofit organization called Free Minds Book Club and Writing Workshop. And here in DC, as you know, we have a unique situation and they serve youth who are charged as adults. So these are youth who are being sent to big time facilities to serve their time. And so we teach the youth that while their body may not be physically free, their mind can be free through books and creative writing. They hold weekly book clubs. They send out newsletters and other educational resources to serve our youth while they're incarcerated and beyond when they return home. We publish several poems and books from our members. And if I may, I'd like to read one that was shared that I think is very timely and relevant to this discussion.
Please.
Thank you. 400 and some years ago, you brought us to this land. 400 and some years ago, couldn't be a man. 400 and some years ago, called us a slave. 400 and some years ago, made us behave. 400 and some years ago, made us figure. 400 and some years ago, my name was. 400 and some years ago, made us wear chains. 400 and some years ago, and it's still the same.
That's powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Melanie, how can people get in touch with you if they'd like to work with you or get information about what you're doing in Washington and across the country? What is your social media handles and your website information?
Thank you. My social media handle is Melanie Bates, LLC. And my website is melaniebates.net.
Wonderful. Well, Melanie Bates, you've been a wonderful guest this afternoon. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you for your commitment. And truly, you are a social engineer and you make us all very proud. Everyone, have a great afternoon. And thank you for listening. Have a great day.
Bye.